up, guys? This is Desm101. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have another episode where I'm going to be taking a look at a retrospective of a series of games. And that's a game that I've already mentioned a little bit in one of my previous videos in talking about the Sega CD. And that, of course, is Silpheed by Game Arts. So, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this series and the games that you might not know about.
Silpheed is a game I became familiar with through the PS2 release, a decent and somewhat overlooked early release for the system. However, the story of Silpheed actually begins in 1986 with a development studio called Game Arts and the game's director, Takeshi Miyagi. Game Arts was founded in 1985 by Takeshi Miyagi when he was only 19 years old. They started out as a computer software company, moving into multiple platforms, releasing influential titles such as the Grandia series. They are still operating to this day. Miyagi had a hit on his hands with 1985's Thexeter, which released on the NEC PC-8 and was making waves with its maze-like side-scroller action, featuring a transforming robot who could fly around a maze or run on foot. The PC-88 was one of the most popular computers in Japan, released in 1981, and it was capable of solid graphics and even FM-enhanced sound. It remained a popular games console computer until the 90s. Miyagi and his team took the idea of creating a 2D shooter that is staged in a 3D playfield, similar to something like Zaxxon, but instead placing the viewer behind the ship in a third-person view and slightly angled above it. The player would control the ship the same as a normal vertical shooter, like Xevious, but the player's ship would diminish in size as it went further up into the screen, as though it were moving farther off into space. The enemies would follow the same behavior and grow larger when approaching the player, when would be modeled from basic polygonal shapes instead of flat bitmaps. This was a pretty novel concept at the time, as just about any games trying to go for 3D visuals were flight sims such as Elite for the BBC Micro from 1984. Thus, Silpheed was released in 1986 for the PC-88. The gameplay is fast and furious, requiring the player to memorize enemy attack patterns to avoid, while also dodging the many shots that litter the screen. Your ship has a shield that can take multiple hits, but after too much damage is sustained, your ship's functions will cease, such as weapons and engines, as you take further damage until the last hit will end the game. This is great because sometimes you can make it through a tough boss fight on your last hit, and it really gives you a rush. There's a lot of visual flair from the opening where a disembodied polygon head taunts you, to the unique stage backgrounds, 3D ships, boss fights, and docking scenes. The gameplay is very challenging, spanning 20 levels, based off a standard variation of 3 types: space, planet, and fortress, which repeat. The game features a power-up system where you shoot orbs to collect various weapons or shield repairs. These also show up on the right side of the screen. The different weapons you can get are options such as homing missiles, an auto-aiming shot, and phalanx spread shot. You have to collect the weapon power-ups first during the level. Then between the stages you can set both weapons to either the left or right side of the ship, which becomes a staple of the series. The story revolves around Zakalite, a terrorist who has taken the helm of a ship called Glory, which now aims to acquire planet-destroying missiles to take over the Milky Way Union. The supercomputer, known as Yggdrasil, has decided you must pilot the SA-01 Silpheed prototype starfighter to stop Zakalite by destroying the Glory ship and save the Milky Way Union. Silpheed ended up being another hit for Game Arts, as the players got their hands on it and generated buzz around the impressive presentation of this unique title. It was later ported to FM77, Apple II, TRS-80 Coco computers in 1988. The DOS port shown here was released in 1989. And even came packaged with the Sound Blaster audio card from Creative to showcase the new hardware and also demonstrate the quality of soundtrack that Game Arts was capable of, which is fantastic in this example. Today, the game still holds quite a bit of charm, but the challenge and odd perspective will likely throw many players off. Since many of the levels and backgrounds repeat and the high level of practice and memorization is required to beat the game, it's best to take a spin with it on places like classicreload.com or pick up a ROM from myabandonware.com to run in DOSBox. With the current string of successes, Game Arts and Miyagi set to develop another Silpheed title, though it took a few years later. During this time between Silpheed games from the late 80s into the 90s, Game Arts released games such as Elysia Dragoon on the Sega Mega Drive, and Lunar for Sega CD. This showed they were moving on to newer platforms, instead of staying on older PCs. The Mega Drive and Sega CD were shaping up to be optimal for their newer releases. Not much is known about the development of the Silpheed game. It was released on Sega CD in 1993, and with no other subtitle or numbering, the game is considered a port by some, though I would argue it's more of a sequel. This time, the enemy is heard as being announced as Zacarte in the intro, but the instruction manual says Zacholite. There's no mention of the Milky Way Union this time, and instead, the story takes place around the Grazon system of planets, which is having their central photon computer hijacked by Zacholite. This time, it's the SA-77 Silpheed fighters that must make their way across 64 light years to reach Earth and fend off Zacholite.
Ready for taxi. Fire alarm check.
The game retains the same third-person perspective behind the back and above view of the ship once again, as the perspective uses the same effect and narrows further away from the screen as objects approach or retreat. The biggest change is the backgrounds, which are now pre-rendered FMV, which blends well with the look of the polygonal ships. Upon first playing the game, you might not even realize it's a full-motion video playing in the background, until you played a bit more and see how Miyagi and his team created the illusion of an interactive background video. What they have done is map out certain hotspots of the background video to activate as obstacles or hazards such as laser beams and perfect timing with the game to make it seem like the objects are in the same space occupied as your ship. Due to the high dependency of timing on the background video, read errors can be more frequent than other Sega CD games. Developers knew of this weakness and implemented a read catch error that will stop the stage and credit the player with an additional continue. If you have a scratched or damaged CD, this could completely stop your progress potentially. It takes place through 12 stages, many of which are in space, but with a variety of scenery. Some stages are packed full of details and action which can make the game overcrowded and hard to keep track of at times. Again, you will need to practice and memorize the stages to get a chance to make it to the end. Although it's not as unforgiving as the first game, as you can use 3 continues to earn more depending on your in-game performance. Some of the enemy designs look like they are based off the original models, and the bosses will follow a similar pattern as the earlier game. In between stages, you sometimes get a cutscene that gives more details on the story as it progresses.
Suddenly started to attack the colony planets. The Grazon system, the central photon computer that integrates and controls the whole galaxy network on the mother planet, Earth, was network jacked by an unknown terrorist group. The leader of the terrorists solemnly introduced himself as Zacarte.
The power-ups are similar to the first game. You can shoot orbs to release shield repairs, point bonuses, and sub-weapon energy. For the weapons, you unlock new ones at the beginning of the next stage, and what you unlock is based on your performance. It's a good variety of weapons to choose from, but not all of them are useful. This game adds new sub-weapons which use opt or option power, although each one is not always available for each stage. These range from a short burst of blast in front of the ship, to a protective shield, to photon missiles and an antimatter bomb. You will need to use these strategically depending on the stage to help you get through some of the tough spots. I used a shield option or photon torpedoes the most. This game has some pretty good music, and the audio is also punctuated with radio chatter from your squadron who are reacting to the enemy attacks. It's a nice detail, but I don't know if it's really needed. Sometimes it sounds more funny than anything. In 1993, this was no doubt an impressive game. Though with the pseudo 3D graphics and gameplay, many were comparing this unfavorably with Star Fox from Nintendo, which released the same year. 2D shooters or shoot-'em-up games were falling out of style in favor of more complex 3D games like Doom or the aforementioned Star Fox. Gamers who were hyped on the fully 3D environments were somewhat let down to discover it was more of a repeating video instead of fully controllable. Still, Silpheed made a good enough of an impression that Game Arts would finally release a true sequel on the PS2 and team up with the legendary developers at Treasure. However, it was without the direction of Takeshi Miyagi.
Release break. Compass open. Coordinate set. Amber 3, ready for launch. All systems
Silpheed: The Lost Planet was released in Japan in 2000 and 2001 in the US on the PS2. Taking place 31 years after the conclusion of the story of the Sega CD game, this is about an unknown alien race referred to as UTOO, invading Earth and taking over by placing an all-consuming shell of biological mass upon the planet's surface. The Silpheed Squadron must lead a daring response to the invasion and save the planet. The game successfully makes the transition to visuals on the PS2, but it's certainly not of the innovative variety like before, instead going for a presentation based more on detailed textures mixed with simple polygonal shapes. When compared to Treasure's later work on Gradius 5, this can look rather drab and repetitive at times, though not entirely uninteresting. It is still rooted in the same mechanics that made the last two games stand out: the third-person behind-the-ship perspective and dual weapons system with shields. The game also retains the radio chatter and cutscenes between some of the stages. In addition to the cutscenes, there are these overly expository introductions for each stage that drag on with a narrator sounding like a lecturer.
18.2200 SRD 0-88-91. At 2000 hours, confirmation obtained on unknown meteorites in orbital zone. 30 minutes later, one scouting SP-13C lost.
Overall, there's perhaps too much emphasis on the story here, but the cutscenes and especially the alien ships do look pretty cool. This time you have unlimited continues, which makes the game more easy to play for longer periods of time. Instead of having orbs that you shoot for power-ups, you now stop mid-level and refuel your ship and shield power, and you can select weapon upgrades if they're available. That means there's no more sub-weapons, which is kind of a letdown, seeing as those were a huge help in the second game. But maybe the unlimited continues are a trade-off. It definitely changes the strategy. The weapon variety is decent, but again, there is many that feel odd or just not useful. This game has mixed reviews from when it was initially released. Most people who didn't like it were not interested in the 2D based gameplay of an old school arcade style shooter, while others liked how it made use of the new PS2 graphical capabilities and effects to enhance the fun gameplay. It doesn't have the same charm that the other previous games had, especially for their time, but I still recommend this game if you're a fan of 2D shooters on the PS2. Like I said before, this game was my introduction to the series. I saw Working Designs had published it, and I knew them from games like Lunar on the Sega CD and Raystorm for PS1. I have been pretty into the game since then, and once I knew there was more games in the series, I was fascinated to learn more about it. Before we wrap up this video, I wanted to briefly mention the spiritual sequel, named Project Silpheed, but Silpheed is spelled with a Y. Released in 2007, this time Game Arts teamed up with Sega for the development, and Square Enix released it or published it here in the US. Game Arts took on more of an advisory role this time, a space dogfight affair with camera planted firmly behind the craft. The game is not remembered much nowadays, but many of its fans will still talk about how much they like it. Reviews at the time did not seem to like the game due to its arcadey flight sim modes, but did generally look upon the graphics favorably. I do recommend to check this out if you like fast-paced spaceflight sim games or unique third-person rail shooters. So in conclusion, I think this is a really fun series with a neat, interesting history behind it. And my personal recommendation out of the series is the Sega CD game first. I have a lot of fun playing that one every time I fire it up. followed by the PS2 release, Silpheed the Lost Planet, and then the DOS game after that, which is really challenging but still quite a bit of fun, and I played with the keyboard. So with that said, that's going to wrap it up for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate all the support, and I hope you have a good one. I'll see you next time.